Moving on with the next part, we have vectors and scalar quantities. Previously, we discussed about basics of forces in motion, different types of forces, Newton's third law, Newton's first law, and also what do forces do. Now we'll talk about two types of quantities that are included in your syllabus, जिनका नाम है scalar quantities and vector quantities. We call them vectors and scalars. Now, quantities can only be of two types, can be one of the two types. It can either be a scalar or it can either be a vector. कौन सी है? Now, scalars are quantities that only have a magnitude. Magnitude क्या होता है? Basically, a number describing how big they are. For example, I have a force in newtons. How do I know how large is that force? The force is of 10 Newton. 10 is the magnitude, n is the unit. So this is the force. ठीक है, आपके पास 10 जो है, 10 is the magnitude and Newton is basically your unit. So a scalar quantity has a magnitude and a unit. तो ये जो 10 Newton है, this is basically a force. अब इस फोर्स को हमने लिखा है 10 न्यूटन करके. जो 10 वैल्यू है, द नंबर which describes how big the force actually is, that number or that digit or that term describing the larger or smaller the force, वो आपके पास magnitude होती है. Whereas the digit symbol after the digit after the magnitude, which is n, for example, denoting newton, वो newton basically आपके पास unit होता है. So scalars are quantities that have only a magnitude, which is a number describing how big they are. Now vectors have both magnitude and direction. जो vector quantities होती हैं, they have both a magnitude and a direction. मतलब कि अगर मैं कहता हूँ 5 न्यूटन to the right, अब इसके अंदर 5 is your magnitude, Newton is your unit, and this arrow is your direction. मतलब आपके पास magnitude भी है, unit भी है, and you also have a direction. This would be indicating a vector quantity. But if I say temperature, temperature को हम कैसे describe करते हैं? For example, 12 degrees Celsius. Can I say 12 degrees Celsius towards left? Wouldn't that be weird? 12 degrees Celsius toward the right. Wouldn't that be weird? How can you define a direction with temperature? Come on. So temperature scalar होगा, because temperature में क्या क्या है आपके पास? You only have a magnitude and you only have a unit. You don't have a direction. Scalar quantities के अंदर you do not have a direction. You only have direction when we talk about vector quantities. Vector quantities में क्या है? The 5 indicates your magnitude and showing Newton, the symbol is your unit, and the direction जो आपको एरो से दिखाई है, that would show कि वो upwards है, downwards है, rightwards है, leftwards है, diagonally है. What is the direction of that quantity? So scalar are the quantities that only have a magnitude and unit. Vectors have both magnitude भी है, unit भी है, and they also have an additional thing known as direction. So the cars in the below diagram have the same speed, a scalar quantity. अब ये अगर हम सिर्फ speed को देखें in this diagram, if you only look at the speed, both have a speed of 10. Both have a speed of 10. Speed तो scalar quantity है. But when we talk about vector, it is 10 meter per second towards the right, and this is 10 meter per second towards the left. When direction is involved, it becomes a vector quantity. So अगर मैं कहूँ the speed of the car is 10 meter per second, it would be your scalar quantity. If I said the speed of the car is 10 meter per second towards right, तो वो मेरी क्या हो जाएगी? That would become a vector quantity. इसीलिए speed को हम scalar में speed ही कहते हैं, and when we talk about vector quantity, we call speed velocity. So the cars have the same speed. दोनों की जो speed है वो क्या है? 10. But दोनों की जो velocity है, velocity is different. One of them is 10 meter per second towards right, and the other one is 10 meter per second towards left. So both the cars have the same speed, but both the cars have different velocity, because velocity क्यों different है? Velocity is a vector quantity, and vector quantity is dependent upon the direction as well. तो अगर आपके पास direction different होगी, तो आपके पास velocity भी change होगी. So both the cars have same speed but different velocities. Examples of vectors and scalar quantities को देख लेते हैं. Now for example, force जो है, force is a vector quantity. It has both magnitude and direction. जैसे कि मैंने आपको बताया 5 न्यूटन downwards. इधर आपके पास magnitude भी है, आपके पास direction भी आ रही है, which is downwards. The force is represented by the arrow, and its length gives the magnitude and the size of the force. Kabhi kabhar, if the value is not present, you can look at the size of the arrow. That would tell you the magnitude. For example, in this diagram, agar main size of the arrow dekho, this is your force 1 and this is your force 2. Now, if you look at the size of the arrow, this one is a small arrow और इस एरो का साइज थोड़ा सा लार्ज है. Now the large indicate determines a high magnitude of force and the small arrow determines a low magnitude of force. मतलब कि the gravity weight due to earth is larger than the drag resistance force due to air, वो आपके पास कम है, which means gravity weight let's say होगी 8 Newton and drag resistance force might be 2 Newton because उसका जो arrow का size है, the size of the arrow is so small कि वो आपको smaller magnitude ही represent कर रहा है, जबकि आपके पास जो दूसरी force का arrow है that is downwards, और वो downward arrow आपके पास एक larger force indicate कर रहा है कि yes it is showing the larger force. So the size of the arrow can also determine the magnitude or the size of the force. Magnitude को हम size of the force भी कहते हैं. And the arrow also shows its direction. अब direction भी तो देखिए ना. Now this is a force of 5 Newton let's say, और इसके साथ direction भी लगी है. You have magnitude, you have unit, you have direction. So this would be a vector quantity. आपका जो force है, force is, that is why it is a vector quantity as it's having a magnitude of 5 Newton as a unit and diagonal as a direction. तो आपके पास दो तरीके हैं magnitude determine करने. Either you can be given the value of the force, is it 5, 10, 15, 20, 18, 17, 60, जो भी है. Or if you don't have a value, how can you determine the magnitude? अगर आपको diagram given है, the size of the arrow can let you know कि आपके पास जो आपके पास size of the arrow, that tells you the size or magnitude of the force. So here we have a list of scalar quantities and we also have a list of vector quantities. So scalar quantities के अंदर we have distance, we have speed, we have time, energy and mass. अब ये वो scalar quantities हैं which only have a magnitude. But vector quantities कौन सी है which have a magnitude and direction both. मतलब कि अगर मैं distance और displacement को compare करूं, distance scalar में क्या हो जाएगा 5 meters. आपके पास सिर्फ magnitude है और unit है. Displacement क्या होगी 5 meters towards the right. This is your displacement. इसके अंदर आपके पास magnitude भी है, you have a unit as well and you have a direction as well. Direction क्या है आपके पास rightwards. Same is the case with speed. अब speed में यहाँ पे कहूँ 7 meter per second. This is your speed. लेकिन velocity क्या होगी 7 meter per second in the forward direction. मतलब speed was only 7 meter per second. अगर मैं इसी को velocity में लिखूं, so it becomes 7 meter per second in the forward direction, gives you the value of a vector quantity. Time is again a scalar quantity. Can you ever tell someone कि the time is 4 p.m. downwards? नहीं, हम time को ऐसे तो नहीं describe करते. Time has no distance. Same is the case with energy and mass as well. Mass has no direction. जो आपके पास mass होता है, mass आपको क्या है 70 kg. वेट क्या होगा वेट 700 न्यूटन डाउनवर्ड्स, क्योंकि वेट की जो डायरेक्शन है दैट इज ऑलवेज डाउनवर्ड्स टुवर्ड्स द ग्रेविटी. जहां आपके पास ग्रेविटी होगी वहां डाउनवर्ड फोर्स लिखी एंड डाउनवर्ड इज अ डायरेक्शन. सो यस वेट हैज अ डायरेक्शन एज वेल. सेम इज द केस विद फोर्स. फोर्स इज अ वेक्टर क्वांटिटी. और फिर आपके पास एक चीज आती है मोमेंटम एज वेल. मोमेंटम इज आल्सो वन ऑफ द वेक्टर क्वांटिटीज. तो स्केलर्स के अंदर फॉर अ क्विक रिविजन वी हैव डिस्टेंस, स्पीड, time, energy and mass, whereas in vectors we have displacement, velocity, acceleration, force, weight and momentum. Forces and motion. इसमें क्या होगा now previously we have done forces. हमने basics पढ़ी थी forces की. When we talked about what do forces do, what are the different types of forces and all of that. हमने 8 to 9 types of forces पढ़ी थी and we also discussed about Newton's third law. उसके बाद we discussed about vectors and scalar quantities. What are the differences between scalars and vector quantities? जो आपके पास scalar quantities हैं, they have a unit, magnitude. Vector quantities के पास unit, magnitude, direction, all three of them are present in vector quantities. Also discussed and listed some of the examples of scalars and vectors through diagrammatic explanations as well. Moving on to the third concept जो आपका है when we link motion with force. Because we know that one of the effects of forces was to cause an object to go in motion. कोई भी object motion में कब जाएगा when a force is applied on it. हमारे पास एक चीज आती है calculating the resultant force. The word resultant क्या होता है? Resultant means overall, total, net. जो आपके पास एक net force बन रही है वो क्या है? The net resultant force, the overall force on the object. So when several forces act on a body, the resultant or the overall force on the body can be found by adding together forces which act in the same direction and subtracting the forces which act in opposite directions. अब आपके पास एक ऑब्जेक्ट के ऊपर, now we have three objects over here, ठीक है, आपके सामने तीन ऑब्जेक्ट्स हैं, 1 2 and 3, ठीक है, you have three objects. अब रूल क्या होता है? Now listen carefully. When several forces act on a body, the resultant overall force on the body can be calculated by adding together forces which act in the same direction. You would add together those forces which act in the same direction and you would subtract those forces which act in opposite direction. So for example, मैं इस पिक्चर में अगर देखूं, I have 5 Newton towards the left, I have 5 Newtons towards the right. अब ये आपके पास opposite directions में नहीं है, एक आपके पास left side पे है, एक आपके पास right side पे. So what am I going to do? I am going to subtract those forces. मैं क्या करूँगा? 5 minus 5 and the resultant force would be 0 Newton. इसका क्या मतलब है कि मेरी जो forces हैं they are balanced. Balanced forces की वजह से an object comes in equilibrium. क्योंकि हमने देखा कि जब भी किसी ऑब्जेक्ट के ऊपर फोर्स पड़ती है दैट ऑब्जेक्ट स्टार्ट्स टू मूव, दैट ऑब्जेक्ट कम्स इन मोशन, वो एक कांस्टेंट मोशन के अंदर आ जाता है. बट व्हेन द फोर्सेस आर बैलेंस्ड, अगर लेफ्टवर्ड फोर्स इज इक्वल टू राइटवर्ड फोर्स, व्हेन अपवर्ड फोर्स इज इक्वल टू डाउनवर्ड फोर्स, व्हेन फॉरवर्ड फोर्स इज इक्वल टू बैकवर्ड फोर्स, all objects would be in equilibrium because we call them balanced forces. तो balanced forces होती हैं, they always cancel out with each other. अगर आप सोचें, if you and your friend are pulling something, आप टग ऑफ वॉर करें, you apply a 5 Newton force, he also applies a 5 Newton force, तो क्या होगा? Both of you are going to keep where you are. आप दोनों हिलोगे नहीं, आपकी forces balanced है. So that is why when we subtract 5 minus 5, the resultant force is 0. Why? Because both the forces were in opposite direction. अगर मैं ऑब्जेक्ट नंबर 2 की बात करूं, इधर मेरे पास जो फोर्स 1 है दैट इज 3 न्यूटन and force number 2 is 7 Newton. Now the thing is that they act in the same direction. And when two forces act in the same direction, we add them together. Adding forces which act in the same direction. जब आपके पास ये भी right पे है, this is also towards the right. तो जब दोनों right पे होंगी, we are going to add those forces. 3 plus 7 makes 10 Newton. और 10 न्यूटन की डायरेक्शन क्या होगी? ऑब्वियसली इट वुड बी टुवर्ड्स द राइट. तो टोटल ऑफ आपके पास 10 न्यूटन फोर्स लग रही है टुवर्ड्स द राइट हैंड साइड. थर्ड ऑब्जेक्ट को देखा जाए, अब यहाँ पे आपको थर्ड ऑब्जेक्ट के अंदर क्या नजर आ रहा है? नाउ दिस इज रादर लिटिल बिट कंफ्यूजिंग. अगेन वी हैव द केस ऑफ एडिंग फोर्सेस और सब्ट्रैक्टिंग फोर्सेस. यहाँ पे मैं क्या करूंगा? आर द फोर्सेस इन द सेम डायरेक्शन or are the forces in the opposite direction? Obviously both the forces are in opposite direction. जो आपको 7 न्यूटन फोर्स है that is towards the left hand side, 3 न्यूटन फोर्स जो है वो towards the right hand side है. तो मैं क्या करूंगा? I am going to subtract because both the forces are in opposite direction and we subtract the forces which act in opposite direction. तो मैं क्या करूंगा? 7 minus 3. अब आंसर जो मेरे पास आया, the answer is 4 Newton. Now how do I determine the direction of my answer? जो मेरा आंसर आया है that is 4 Newton by subtracting both the forces, leftward forces minus the rightward forces. अब डायरेक्शन में कैसे पता करूंगा कि whether it's left or right, which one of the forces is a larger force? Is 7 Newton a larger force or is 3 Newton a larger force? Obviously the 7 Newton force is a larger force और उसकी डायरेक्शन क्या थी? Leftwards. So the direction of the answer would also towards be left. क्योंकि जो आपकी लार्जर फोर्स थी, जो लार्जर फोर्स की डायरेक्शन होगी वही आपके रिजल्टेंट फोर्स की डायरेक्शन होगी. सो दिस कॉन्सेप्ट इज वेरी वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. ये आपके पास जो केस 1 है, केस 2 एंड केस 3, इट इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट कि जब भी आपके पास फोर्सेस जो है व्हेन दे एक्ट इन द सेम डायरेक्शन यू वुड बी एडिंग द फोर्सेस, व्हेन दे एक्ट इन द ऑपोजिट डायरेक्शन you would be subtracting those फोर्सेस, और आपने अगर रिजल्टेंट फोर्स ऑपोजिट डायरेक्शन में निकाली है, फॉर एग्जांपल इन दिस केस मैंने 4 न्यूटन निकाली थी, हाउ एम आई गोइंग टू डिटरमिन द डायरेक्शन ऑफ माय आंसर रिजल्टेंट फोर्स? जो आपके पास लार्जर फोर्स होगी वही वाली डायरेक्शन में आपकी रिजल्टेंट फोर्स भी लगेगी।